Violence is a learned behavior that is reinforced through social and cultural norms and transmitted as a communicable disease, right? And so anything that can be learned can be unlearned, and anything that can be transmitted can be interrupted.
Woo, welcome. You have now entered Mad Warfare, mutually assured distraction, where we explore the weird, terrifying, and sometimes hilarious ways war is fought today, and how we can all protect our minds before we go too mad to find them.
Oh my!
Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern.
Can you talk if you haven't got a brain?
Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern.
What do a frog comic book, a North Dakota rancher, and a Chicago gang mediator have in common? They're all part of one guy's argument that the most powerful weapon in an information war isn't a fact check. Hello, it's a story. Welcome back to Mad Warfare. I'm Jocelyn Brady.
And howdy, partners. I'm Sean Anthony Guillory.
Our guest today is a storyteller, health communicator, and founder of Odd Duck, a social change consultancy has battled COVID misinformation in the deadliest county in the world, I think, at least America, helped defeat 9 anti-vaccine bills by recruiting MAGA ranchers as allies, and co-authored the USA Today bestseller, Interrupting Violence. Please welcome Josh Gryniewicz. So, Josh, your resume says a storyteller, comic book writer, health communicator, violence prevention strategist, and a legislative lobbyist. That's either the most eclectic LinkedIn profile I've ever seen or a cry for help. Maybe both. How did all of this become one job?
Well, I blame it on my ADD. As you mentioned for the top, I do run a consultancy, Odd Duck. So it's not just me. I have a team around me. But it was a circuitous route to get here. My background is actually in psychology originally. I went into health communications, working in public health, primarily working with public health approach to public safety that treated violence as a transmitted disease and then intervened accordingly. When I worked my way up to communication director, and part of my mandate was to actually roll out a national expansion. We were focused primarily in Chicago at the time. And we had a 4-university evaluation conducted that demonstrated the effectiveness up to 68% in some communities in Chicago at reducing shootings and killings. And I had thought, oh, my job is done and over. Here we go. Every city's going to want to roll out the red carpet and bring us, there's going to be ticker tape parades. They're going to want this model everywhere because anywhere that there's violence, this can be effective. The evaluation hit, crickets. And at the same time, we had a documentary film being made, The Interrupters, directed by Steve James, who did Hoop Dreams, and Alex Kotlowitz, who wrote There Are No Children Here. It did not get into the science at all. It focused primarily on 3 of the interrupters and telling their personal stories and showing how effective they were at intervening in gang violence. And everything that we thought was going to happen with the evaluation ended up happening with the documentary, minus the ticker tape parades and the red carpet. But we expanded. We went from 1 city and 28 communities in Chicago and Illinois to Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia, New Orleans, nationwide, and then global. So today it's known as Cure Violence Global. It's an international operation. They have had up to 90% reductions in some places throughout Latin America. Incredible work. And for me, the transformation was like, okay, there is something to this story thing. So I went back to grad school, got a degree in creative writing and English lit, and said, okay, I'm going to marry health communications and storytelling. And that's sort of where my origin story started.
That's where you put on the mask for the first time.
Yeah, yes, exactly. But it was one of those like pull down masks, right? So I wasn't full like Spider-Man yet.
I see.
Oh, that's a really violence as a communicable disease. I've never heard that
I'm glad you.
before. That's really interesting. And what a great framing, a way for us to think about how it can spread.
Absolutely. And it makes we say the academic speak is violence is a learned behavior that is reinforced through social and cultural norms and transmitted as a communicable disease, right? And so anything that can be learned can be unlearned, and anything that can be transmitted can be interrupted.
Actually, I really don't want to lose this thread, but the one thing you kind of mentioned in terms of the crickets after you're like, here's the proof. We did the data. Here's the data right here, because a lot of folks are like, oh yeah, I kind of need the data. I need the measures of effect. I need the measures of performance. And when you show it, they're like, oh great, thanks. I mean, that may be. I don't know if that's another reason you kind of went more towards. It's usually the story that ends up convincing folks. If it was just something where you could just throw the spreadsheet in front of them and then I don't know, like the light from
They
the Ark of the Covenant
wish it.
just hits them, and
Yes,
it's just
exactly.
like oh,
And their
I see the
faces
light.
melt.
That would be nice again, but the data itself is usually not convincing. So yeah, I don't know if that's also
I'll say too, Sean, like I love data. I think
Mhm.
data is
Me
fantastic.
too. Nothing sexier
And
than a spreadsheet to me. So
nothing sexier. I think all of this calls for an Excel spreadsheet right now. But in we make decisions based on emotional reactions, right? And then retroactively we go back and justify them, right? And that's just human behavior. And so if it was as easy as just making a decision based off of the data, the world would be in a lot better place. Right?
That's when we get the flying cars and that
Absolutely.
hoverboard from Back to the Future too. Yeah, if only.
I'm going to throw this little pivot in here. North Dakota,
North
not the
Dakota.
place people think of when we're talking about the front lines of information war. At least I don't think of North Dakota, sorry.
No, that's fair.
But you discovered something there and it turned into this really big change, kind of a big deal. Can you walk
Yes.
us through what happened?
Absolutely. So this is actually work that we did in partnership with the Foundation for a Healthy North Dakota and the team over there. And I think it would help actually to zoom out and to provide a little bit of context both about
Sure, sure,
why
sure.
North Dakota and some of the work that we were doing. So Odd Duck had started working on what we had thought was just going to be a conventional health communication campaign right at the start of the pandemic. We were working in 5 cities: Chicago, New York, New Orleans, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. This was actually in conjunction with a lot of the violence prevention groups. So, a lot of violence interrupters, when we went into lockdown, sort of transitioned their roles into community health workers. And they were a transmission vehicle for getting some good information out there. What we thought was going to happen, right, was that we would do this health communication strategy and everything. And like so many in public health, we were blindsided by just the sheer volume of mis and disinformation that was out there. And we're not prepared for that. And so my team and I sort of went back and we said, okay, we're going to have to throw out all the conventional playbook. And we're going to have to basically start from scratch and figure out how to do this in the reverse. Because if we tried to just nip misinformation in the bud over social media, right, we'd be playing whack-a-mole and it would be impossible to keep up. So we said, we need to go to the source. People are the source. Let's take a grassroots approach. Let's invert the whole process and let's work with these community health networks, right? Do it on the ground. About a year into that, we had been successful. We had actually one of the most successful sort of campaigns on the ground, navigating around the mis and disinformation. And we had a funder come to us and say, "Can you codify this? We don't know what you're doing. Nobody knows what you're doing. Nobody knows what they're doing." But whatever it is, it seems to be working. And we were like, okay, that's kind of my wheelhouse. So we codified it, and then they had a CDC funded project that was 2,500 communities across the country. So talking about data, I was like, wait, 2,500 is more than five. Yes, we will work with them and look at their examples. And so the codified publication basically crosswalked everything that we were doing with our model with these 2,500 models across the country. It's been downloaded well over 10,000 times. It's been applied by hundreds, if not thousands, of community organizations on the ground, and it went rolling. So Sandy Tipke, the executive director of the Foundation for Healthy North Dakota, saw me speaking about the model and said, "We have a problem in North Dakota. Can you bring the model here and can we do something about it?" Now, North Dakota has two distinctions. One of them, Jocelyn, you already teed up, which is that it had at peak COVID one of the deadliest counties in the world. You were right the first time, in the world for COVID. Right. And then it was one of the third highest volumes of misinformation in the country. So third only to Texas and Florida. And when you take population into consideration, it's already a staggering fact. When you take population into consideration, it's just mind blowing. Right. And so obviously, correlation does not equal causation. Going back to the data nerds again.
Here, here.
But at the same time, there is pretty compelling evidence that misinformation, and specifically not having accurate information, was killing people, is killing people, right? So what Sandy and her team at the foundation and my team with Odd did is we did statewide listening tours, meeting with people, and essentially we went in rather than kind of the conventional approach of we're going to talk to you about how important vaccines are, we're going to show you the data, we're going to roll this all out. We just went in with questions and we said, hey, we want to talk to you about what is going to make your community healthier, what is going to make your community safer, and what is going to establish community well-being. And that in itself was disarming enough for people to want to work with us, to put forward suggestions, and to actually carry on the work long after the funding had dried up.
Wow, so fancy that you have
Interesting.
conversations instead of talking at people and tisking,
Fancy
and they
that!
seems to work.
Exactly.
What was kind of that moment in terms of even with some of the initial opposition? What kind of turned them, or what events kind of turned them and convinced them to kind of want to team up with y'all?
So there was a group. I say if all of this health communication stuff doesn't work out, I got a great idea for a reality show. It's the Rancher Housewives of Medora County. I would love to watch that. We went in for a listening session there, rural community, primarily ranchers, a lot of anti-vax folks. They came into the meeting. I overheard as they were talking that, literally saying we'd come to pick a fight, right? But our approach, essentially deflated that intention, right? And when we said open-ended, we want to work with you. We don't want to, Jocelyn, as you said, we don't want to preach at you, right? What is it going to take? We began actually coming up with strategies in real time for what it was going to take. And ultimately, not just in that county, but throughout the state, we were able to win over a number of, MAGA hat wearing ranchers, right, who would make the argument more effective than anything that we would have incubated in our, communication workshop or focus group. Essentially, we vaccinate our herds, we vaccinate, our animals, but we don't think twice about sending our children to school completely unprotected, right? And this is them making this argument on our behalf. So it was a really powerful turning point, pivot, and I think it speaks to just sort of meeting people where they're at and having a conversation.
I mean, that's amazing. Because again, help the audience out, because I know you had to help me out with this too, in terms of they absolutely do recognize that if they don't vaccinate their animals, like in terms of bottom line and just
It's like
what they'd
catastrophic.
have
Well,
to do for yeah.
100%. And that was kind of like the conversation point, right? Was essentially looking at, you know, and this wasn't kind of us preparing talking points and submitting them.
Yeah,
It
it sounds
was
like they're doing it
arrived at
too.
through ongoing conversation, dialogue.
Yeah.
There were conversations without us in the room. But what a lot, there were so let's see, 2010 to 2020, zero anti-vax legislation put forward in the House. 2010, or sorry, 2020 to 20, I believe 23. So in that short span of time, something
Mhm.
like a dozen or 2 dozen anti-vax
Gotcha.
legislation put forward. Some of this criminalized healthcare workers who would be administering the vaccine. Some of it called for just an outright ban on vaccines throughout the state. And so that was the leverage point where, suddenly the ranchers are like, wait. Okay, if you're going to take away our ability to immunize our animals, right, then we're going to have a crisis on our hands. And so pull that thread a little bit. All right, well, you know, if that is true in those instances, then where else is it true? And one of the things that we had talked about kind of in some of our earlier conversations, Sean, that you just sort of reminded me
Feel free to
that I
pull back the curtain. Tell them
yeah,
everything.
Well, in our earlier conversation, I would say, that because of the climate, the political climate in the state, and the conversation, how the vaccines themselves had become politicized and polarized, you would have folks who were conservative who had gotten the vaccine, right, or gotten vaccines themselves and gotten vaccines for their families, but were reluctant to even go into the grocery store with the band-aid on their arm
Oh, gotcha.
because they
Yeah.
didn't want to be called out as going against, kind of the party logic, right? So this is sort of the climate. And I think part of what was done when, we started having these discussions and pointing out kind of the, hey, like, if you're seeing the logic here, was it released some of that pressure to maintain pretenses, right? A lot of what we do across campaigns, not just with COVID, is to look for opportunities to identify the broader narrative that an issue lives inside, and then create some cognitive dissonance so that folks can actually entertain alternate perspectives.
It points to how important it is to have a diversity of perspectives. Because it's, I wouldn't have thought of that who would have, if you're
Very
living
good.
in a city or you grew up, in an urban environment, you don't necessarily think about, oh, wow, our entire food supply is implicated in this, or these people living, the people come who take care of animals and just have a completely different perspective. And we need to bring all types in so we see this is the true ramification of if we enact this X or Y or Z legislation, let alone it criminalizing what medical providers are doing.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Well, and I'll say I don't want to take too much credit, right? Odd Duck doesn't want to take too much credit because in actuality, these are solutions that the community themselves are arriving at, right? So all we're doing
Mm.
is providing the space and the platform for people to explore questions that they already have, but maybe given the political climate, are reluctant or afraid to ask.
Now I gotta say this out loud because if this frames the rest of the conversation, this is fine. It's not even really a question, even though there are things you can say afterwards. The thing that it's just coming to me like what I really find amazing about all these works and all these kind of paths that you take in. I come across a lot of folks in terms of strategic communication, information operations, and they're like, how can I help things in terms of like my everyday life or things, like, in the homeland, grassroots. And a lot of folks just don't like how to get started. And I would love to hear. It's almost again like less about like you finding the work and the work almost finding you, but for that kind of audience that we kind of have out there where they kind of want to do the things that you're doing, like okay, like finding these things and using their kind of strategic communication or knowledge on narrative and whatnot to help out. I'd love to give you the floor, even if that's something where we talk about more things that you've done, just
Sure.
things that kind of like frame this conversation, because that's what I'm really coming to with
People
this.
itching to get
Yeah.
involved.
Correct. Yeah, they're just trying to. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So I have a few. The first will be like more self-serving, but just to speak
Fine,
to
please.
how we perceive many of these issues differently at Odd Duck is that we, one, look at communication, information within an ecosystem, a narrative ecosystem, right? So we differentiate story from narrative, right? And story,
Continue on that. Yeah.
story, anecdote, lore, all of these are ingredients that feed up to broader narratives and ultimately to what we refer to as meta narratives. So those broader narratives that these little units of narrativity feed up to, right? Because nobody transforms their entire thinking based off of one book, one movie, one documentary, one series. It would be great if they did, right? Because mission accomplished, right? But it's multiple units of narrativity that are feeding up to these broader narratives, and then we take it a layer further. Meta narrative is sort of the ideology that fuses together around narratives, right? So a good example would be in public safety, right? There is often racialization of crime, the fear of urban environments and crime in urban environments is not does not keep up with the statistics, right? So even when you have data that shows year after year crime going down, we still have law and order policies, increased enforcement, and honestly, underlying anxieties about urban environments that continue to go up. Now, these are narratives, but they're also the ideas behind them are the meta narratives. Now, part of the reason why I was saying we try to identify where our issues and the issues that we're addressing live in narrative, right, or what narrative they live in, is because then we can not just counter narrativize, which is where most strategic communicators stop, right, but we essentially can deconstruct that narrative, find the connection points in that meta narrative, and that's where that cognitive dissonance piece, feeding up strategic stories that disrupt that thinking, right?
So would an example
Yeah, this is
be,
great. Like,
yeah, like vaccines are bad would be up here. And then when you're talking about the cognitive dissonance, it's like, well, pulling apart when you have the ranchers coming in and saying like, well, here's a story about what happens on the ranch if you don't use vaccines. Is that an
I mean
example of that?
that's an example. A part of it is also where people are getting their information from and
mm,
who they're getting with. So if you have a nurse who, like, so much of this work, and that's why I'm reluctant to take too much credit for it, right? Because so much of this work is conversations that are happening at the back of the church with a nurse and a frightened mom, and the nurse saying, well, actually, some of the stuff that you've been hearing isn't accurate, right? So it's activating people who are effective messengers. I always give this example of North Carolina. There was a big vaccine drive at a retirement community, and we were looking again in the academic speak, we were looking at the people who were the nodes, the people who could activate the
gotcha.
community and bring folks out. And so we go, and there was a grandmother who hosted the bunko night at her in her condo, and she was definitely like the one. She was in everybody's business for better or for worse. And we said, "You're a community leader. Would you be willing to try to bring out some of your neighbors to the vaccination clinic?" And she goes, "Oh, no, no, no. I'm not a community leader. I just like bunko." And I was like, "Okay, could you fill this bus?" Right? And she goes, "Oh, honey, we're going to need a bigger bus."
Bigger bus. Gotta get Jaws.
Like in Jaws,
Oh my-
exactly.
Gotta get to
And she
Jaws.
filled
Oh
two
my
of
gosh.
them. So,
Two of them as well.
so a lot of folks who are
An
those
armada
community
at this point.
leaders, they don't recognize themselves that way. They don't see themselves in leadership positions, right?
Called Jon
But
Snow
they
about
have
it.
the influence. Very Jon Snow about it. Exactly.
Get a reference
Exactly. We are all over the
Like-
pop culture continuum. I love it. This is my
No,
jam.
we figured that going in. We figured that going in. Like, this is going to be fun. And let me also take a quick step back. I think you actually did a pretty damn good job right there in terms of almost giving like a visualization of like what is up in this, cognitive domain and whatnot. Anyway, let you continue. But I did want to kind of like call that out.
Well, I have another one, and if you want to,
Yeah, like please put more
add
paint
this to
on
the
there
show
again.
notes
Bob
or
Ross
whatever.
it.
And follow
Bring it
Josh.
on.
Follow Josh. And speaking of more stories and narratives, your book, Interrupting Violence, you have really incredible stories in there from what we talked about. And one of them, you're talking about a drive-by shooting. And this nearly breaks down, like triggers a retaliation, breaks down the community until someone stepped in. Can you tell us
Yeah.
about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and thank you for bringing up the book. So, Interrupting Violence, I wrote it in with a longtime friend, my brother, Kobe Williams, who actually spent he was a member, a shot caller in one of the most notorious gangs in the country. Went through a transformation himself and has spent the last 20 plus years as a violence prevention expert. And so we collaborated on this book in part to tell his story, to share his story, and in part because we wanted to essentially, when you have a program, right, that can prevent shootings and killings without increasing incarceration, that should be shouted from the rooftops.
Win-win. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so we collaborated on that. There are three main mediations that are followed throughout the book. One of them is Jocelyn, the drive-by that you're describing, which actually opens the book. And essentially what Kobe does, which is different than a law enforcement approach, is to go in and try to figure out and get an understanding of what the situation is, why it's arised, what's happening, and then intervene in that, the potential violence, right? So you have a bunch of guys who are on the corner, drive-by happens, and they see the car, so they know who they're going to go after, right? And then part of it is the ticking clock of Kobe trying to get to these guys first and find out why they initiated this attack in the first place before a retaliation can kick off. Right now, what ends up turning out, and I don't think I'm spoiling my own book here, but what it turns out is it was a misunderstanding. Neither party was involved in the initial incident that prompted the drive-by, right? But we would have never gotten to that understanding because what would have happened without interrupters, without community violence intervention network in place, without the work of Kobe and others like him who do this work, what would have happened is that these guys would have gone after the guys who had just shot at them, retaliated, maybe taken out one of their guys. Then they would have justification to go after them again, take out a couple of their guys, and then it just grows exponentially. And when we talk about violence as, a transmission, right? This is exactly what we're talking about. That we all saw those little charts of how COVID spreads, right? You got one little person who's infected, and then that goes and branches out to two more people, and
Super
then
spreaders.
four more people, and exactly. And that's the same. There are so many parallels with violence that oftentimes when we're having these conversations, people are like, well, isn't that just a metaphor? And it's like, no, this is psychological transmission,
Next.
right? This is emotional transmission. And so, so how law enforcement would traditionally approach that is when they arrived at the scene of a drive-by, they would likely have all those guys who are ostensibly victims sit down on the curb. They would do background checks on them. They would maybe find an outstanding warrant or, this, that, and the other thing. And then the victims end up being the ones who are picked up, right? And the retaliation still happens. So it's still escalating the violence, right?
It's worse.
So it's worse. Exactly.
The parallel between that and it's extremely striking. When the retaliation happens, like, okay, I know who did that one.
Yes.
And then it kind of goes, and that's the same thing with online. Like, okay, who started this here? Like, where does this bit of disinformation come from that, now I can't even talk to, aunts and uncles at Thanksgiving? Like, what the hell happened here?
And
who started this?
you hit the nail.
Yeah.
Well, earlier I had said kind of the academic speak and what we would, violence is a learned behavior that's transmitted through, or violence is a learned behavior that's reinforced through social and cultural norms and transmitted like a disease, right? But a large part of, and Jocelyn backed me up on this, but a large part of creative writing, right, is that you show, don't tell, right? You're showing, and that
100%.
was the impetus that drove us through the book, right? We wanted to show all of these social and cultural factors that were pushing Kobe from the very beginning to follow the trajectory that he did, and being reinforced with so many of the others that he's working with and intervening on. And that's how the interruption happens, right? That's how you prevent those super spreaders. Yeah, so you hit the nail on the head that I'm like, yes, absolutely. And one of the things we did, I mean, it was very important to us that it be, in Kobe's words, his experience, right? There is a long tradition of white journalists and writers and academics and filmmakers going into impoverished communities and trying to, explore the issue of violence, with, our college educated, backgrounds. And, one of the things that we had decided early on was like, it has to be, in Kobe's words, Kobe's experience, right? So that meant hundreds of hours of interviews. It also meant interviewing, hundreds of hours of interviews with family members and friends and, other former gang members and so on. And one of the reasons that I bring this up, one of the interviews that I did, the guy said basically the same thing you're pointing out, Sean, that he said, oftentimes you have kids who are in a gang, joining a gang, inheriting a beef that is now 3 generations long, right? And so they're like, well, I'm into it with these guys because, they killed so and so and such and da da da, but they couldn't even tell you how it started. Right. So we're talking generations, and they can't even tell you how it started. We just know, we really hate those guys. And they're saying the same thing. And so much of this is like reactions looking for excuses.
What a good phrase in terms of that too. Reactions looking for excuses.
Yeah.
There's a lot of pearls falling from this meeting of ours, because yeah.
What's interesting is, I don't know if I'll be able to articulate this, but there's some problems with the Portland government and like everywhere, but a lot of inefficient crap, and they're fighting over what to do, and so like years go by and they're doing nothing. And one of some of their arguments are, we need to find the most cost effective and the most efficient ways to like address homelessness or whatever the problem is. And what I'm hearing from you, what this is making me think about is, we have this cultural obsession, like a myopic focus on efficiency and productivity, and it needs to be fast and it needs to be cheap. And that's not, when you look at, what's the most potent thing? These hundreds of hours of interviews to get just the right story
very good, Jocelyn.
that actually changes minds.
No, that's right. And I feel like there is, we think very short term, at the same time moving very fast and trying to be efficient, right? So we think in terms of election cycles, and whatever social change that we're trying to put on the table is between legislative sessions, and and this is one of the ongoing conversations that I have with a lot of my clients, is we have to take to your point, Jocelyn, we have to take a much longer term approach, and it can't be just driven by policies. We have to look at the overarching narrative that we're trying to deconstruct.
How people actually work. More on stories that may or may not work. So some stories do help us understand the world better. And then there's Law and Order. Make your case.
Oh, I'm always picking on Law and Order. Yes. So I'll actually say, Law and Order is just an excellent exemplar of kind of phenomenon that we've already been talking about, which is that so many people, most everyday citizens don't have regular interactions with police or justice system, right? And so their exposure comes from, did you know 70% of network television dramas are cop shows?
Wow.
Did not.
70%, or feature in some way or another a storyline following a cop. Right? That's and so if you're not having any personal lived experience, right, and your primary source of how the system works comes from that 70%, and who knows, it may be that like 65% of that is Law and Order reruns. I don't know. But Law and Order is an exemplar of that, because it does it shows the good guys always catch the bad guys, right? The system always works. It's seamless from beginning to end, right? And everything gets resolved in that 1 hour story arc. Right? So we were invited shortly before the book was released. We were actually invited to the White House. So this is different cast, different season. Before Kid Rock was hanging out in the Oval Office. Yeah, of the White House. Yeah. Before Kid Rock was hanging out in the Oval Office. And we were going to, we were going to be on a panel with Allison Flowers, who's like a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who covers police accountability. Dee Watkins, who was a HBO writer with the team from The Wire on the show We Own This City, focused on Baltimore. He's also a very talented author, has written some incredible memoirs on his own. And Alex Kotlowitz, who directed or helped with, he's like essentially a legend in social change, like creative nonfiction. Wrote There Are No Children Here. He was a writer on The Interrupters. So we have this panel discussion, and we're coming in and we're going to talk about like basically the discrepancy. How are we looking at public safety narrative? How does that 70% definitely outweighs, the 5 writers that are on this panel, right? And what can we do about changing the narrative? So the White House has this out now 2 weeks before I'm going in for this presentation. The organizers of the event call and they say, hey, we're super excited. We have a very high profile addition to the panel, and you're going to love it. It's going to be great. And it's going to get us a lot of attention. And it turned out to be Ice-T, who of course plays Detective Finn on Law and Order SVU. And so for 2 weeks, I'm like, oh my God, what do I do? I take the sandwich method. I'm like, oh, I really liked your earlier work in New Jack City, but
New Jack
for
City.
the last 2 decades. So thankfully they dropped him from the panel and met with him separately, but it was a little hand wringing. The broader point is like that it kind of illustrates sort of like what we're talking about when we talk about, this framing of narrative and stories as unit. When we're talking about, again, bringing all of this back together, right? When we're talking about how is it that, the average citizen who, again, doesn't have regular contact with police, right, with the justice system, has this perception that urban environments are dangerous and scary, that crime is constantly going up, 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 and that we have to reinforce law and order policies that increase incarceration and, militarize police departments. All of that rhetoric is driven, and all of that narrative is driven and reinforced not just by the evening news and if it bleeds, it leads, and how we cover crime in the media.
Yeah.
It's also driven by the 70% of cop dramas on TV, and that informs real life policies that are affecting people's lives, affecting entire communities.
Yeah.
So that in a nutshell is sort of like our working theory of narrative change.
Oh my gosh.
I get all my
No, but-
cop information from Reno 911.
Right?
So
Yes.
like a-
Oh my God.
Exactly.
Oh my God. So
Very good.
last 2 weeks ago, I was having dinner with friends, and I tend to, I don't know if you guys have gathered this about me, but I tend to get on a soapbox about certain things. And so I got on a soapbox and I was talking about like cop again, and somebody brought up, they were like, "What about Reno 911?" And I was like,
They say that like a gotcha?
Yes.
Like, oh.
yes. Like, okay, I make an exemption for Reno 911 because nobody watches that show and goes, "Oh my God, yes, I have to," police are going to bail us. We can't arrest our way out of this problem.
Both in terms of on TV, if it's 70%, yikes, on the TV, plus what's usually pushed on algorithms is usually this very violent narrative that like, oh, maybe you should get a security system or a ring camera because they could do this to you too.
Have you ever seen, or either of you seen the sort of walls up, walls down emotion chart for emotional intelligence?
Walls up, walls down.
Yeah,
Tell us
so-
more.
Relook at it.
So they-
Continue.
And it's essentially based on one-to-one communication, right? Although I think it's pretty easy to see how it works one-to-many as well. And essentially, it measures folks' openness to communication based on the emotional response that's elicited. So things like guilt, shame, anger, rage, fear, right? Those are walls up emotions, right? Hope, positivity, joy, celebration. Those are walls down emotions because they facilitate communication, they facilitate openness. Now, what ends up happening with the algorithm and what we're talking about, right? And this is actually, I'm totally going into your wheelhouse now, but this is one of the things that, the Russian bot farms did so well, right, is they created closed loop conversations that didn't leave any room for anything other than feeling that emotion. So walls up, right, short circuited by fear, by anger, by rage, by guilt, by shame, right? Rather than let's have a conversation. And it works really well in the algorithm. It works really well online, and it works really well at shutting down conversation. And so going back to, from a messaging, strategic communication standpoint, we need more hopeful messaging, and we also need more messaging that engages the walls down approach and facilitates actual discourse, right?
Very good.
We need more cute animals.
And
Yeah.
cute animals! More cats!
Yeah. Is it?
Hair down those walls.
Yeah.
Yes.
Kitties.
That makes me think of the toward in a way, like another way to look at it. If you're feeling toward or you're feeling away, toward is I'm moving toward it because I'm feeling joy and invitation and curiosity, or a way like, yeah, I'm staying in my little bubble, don't talk to me.
Version.
Yeah.
Well, and going back to the ranchers, right? What we were doing was asking motivational interviewing questions and actively engaging them in their perspectives, their opinions, right? But they had come in expecting a walls up approach where they were going to engage in a fight, right? That's what they were pushing, right?
Yeah. Just like literally imagining a wall, like a fortress wall. Slowly, just kind of peeking through, and then over time, it's okay. We can engage.
And engage, yeah.
Do you feel like there's like a big message you want to make sure that our audience, which is again like folks trying to better understand things around information operations, not kinetic warfare, plus folks who are kind of more everyday folks who may just come here for the yucks, the chuckles, but also seeing like, okay, how can I contribute to this country with whatever skills I have? I may know how to make damn good cupcakes, or I may how to play bunco. I can set up a mean bunco tournament. What kind of message or what kind of things do you want to leave these folks with, since you have the mic? You have the soapbox. We are not stopping you from this
You're not going to
soapbox.
push me off the soapbox with a Reno 911 reference. So, first of all, thank you for asking that. The first thing that I'll say, we fervently believe that narrative is cultural infrastructure, right? So if we're talking about making social change,
Say that for the people in the back. Go on. That was actually, damn, there's so much good stuff. Yeah.
So if we're talking about making change, if we're talking about making social change, if we're talking about making cultural change, if we're talking about making the world a better place, then we have to address the narrative. We have to see the narrative, we have to shape the narrative, and ultimately we have to create a narrative that shows the world as a better place, right? So that if there's one message that I want to share with your audience, that's it, right? As far as things people can do, I think honestly, not to be too la-ti-da or Pollyanna-ish, but
no.
I really think that we need to stop allowing the algorithms to infect our daily interactions with people in the real world. One of the refrains that I hear all the time in this work, and that frustrates me to no end, is this idea of, well, both sides. Well, both sides are XYZ, right? Or both sides are contributing misinformation, or both sides are trying to manipulate you, right? And it's like, both sides say this. No, I'm just kidding. No.
That gets meta real quick.
But the point is that there are no sides. We have to stop being so binary and polarizing, even in our perception, because we're dealing with human beings across a continuum. And people hold lots of conflicting ideas in their heads as well. And so I think whether it's the muffin cookers or the bunco players or whatever, it's activating more opportunities like that for human engagement on human levels, right? Period. Hard stop.
No, that's beautiful.
Yeah. Go bring muffins to your neighbors, kids.
Yes, and ask them to play a game of bunco. I've never played bunco in my life, to be honest.
No, like we need, like, for the folks out there, is it like a mix between like bingo but has dice? I remember that anyway.
There
It
dice
sounds like
in-
It is not. So
I
it's not
thought
like
I
you
thought
have
it
to,
was
like,
cards. Okay.
So the great, but see, it's become a cop show now. Now it's the great bunko mystery. It became a
Man.
game of Clue.
Tell us, everyone. Put it in the comments. Put it in the chat. Tell us what bunko
Yeah, we
is.
wanna hear.
Solve the mystery.
Oh my gosh.
Josh, is there anything that you'd like to give a shout out to and promote? And how can people find you?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I would say Interrupting Violence is available everywhere books are sold. And I've always wanted to say that. I've spent my entire life wanting to say that, and now I finally can. So, woo!
Da-da-da.
If people are interested in the discussion on narrative, in conversations around stories and storytelling, they can look us up at oddduck.io. I'm pretty easy to track down that way, or just email me, Josh at oddduck.io.
Wonderful. I feel like we need a, meh, a duck sound. I can't do a duck sound. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Let's all
much.
do our impression.
Thank you. This has been great.
Thank you.
This has exceeded my every expectation, and I already had high expectations.
Oh my goodness, it was that good.
I've come to talk with you again. Come and be inside my head. Cancel me, cancel me. I got things to say, you can cancel me. Cancel me, cancel me. I got things to say, you can cancel me. Cancel me, cancel me. I got things to say, you can cancel me. It's only a matter of time till we all win. Cancel God's say. It's only a matter of time till we all win. Cancel God's say. It's only a matter of time till we all win. Cancel God's say. Cancel me. Cancel me. Cancel me. I got things to say. You can cancel me. Cancel me. Cancel me. I got things to say. You can cancel me. Cancel me. Cancel me. I got things to say. You can cancel me.